Welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, April 3rd, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look about a year and a half ahead from today into the 2026 United States Senate elections. My last time making a video on this was all the way back in February, and I thought it would be fitting that we decided to do one today right after the special elections in Florida and the regularly scheduled Supreme Court race in Wisconsin, after we saw some very interesting and very telling election results that could help us inform ourselves as to what we might see in 2026. Now, the Senate map here isn't going to change too drastically from my last prediction in February. If you are someone who watched the last video or just want to go ahead and check it out, you can find it on my channel. But the point being that I'm going to try to keep this video a little bit on the shorter side, largely because I don't want to waste too much time talking about races that really aren't going to be that competitive, and at which we haven't really seen that much change in terms of candidacy announcements, candidacy expectations, and what we might expect in terms of overall margin. And with that being said, we always kick off our videos like these by characterizing the races that we determine to be safe. States that we know are going to be a bit more of the solid Democratic and solid Republican side that we need to give some, time to showcase, but really don't need to spend too much time talking about it. Taking a look at what we've seen across the country here, I think it's going to be pretty solid in many of these Republican states. The Deep South is never really going to be touched by Democrats ever again, at least not in the foreseeable future. And so where we are right now is pretty much very solid for the GOP. Starting off, this is one of the more favorable maps. The Senate math is almost always favorable to the Republican Party as well, so it's very difficult to see how Democrats even come close to winning back the Senate majority in 2026. It doesn't certainly seem to be too possible, at least, but it's not outside of the realm of possibility, but it's certainly not the likeliest or even close to being likely. So Republicans pretty much start out with a pretty solid 48 seats in the United States Senate. And that leaves Democrats to contest the remaining roughly 13 races that are going to be less than safe for them, but not safe for the GOP. But it gets trickier here. The last video I actually had Texas as a safe Republican state. Now, I will have to say, a lot of why I don't consider it safe is because of Ken Paxton, who's currently leading the Republican primary polling. He has a lot more baggage on his plate that doesn't really matter to the Republican electorate, more so that it matters to the general election electorate. So Texas, I think, will kick us off as the first state that I'm going to consider to be likely for the Republican Party. But it's going to be a little bit closer. I think Colin Allred's intended to run here, too, as well. So it should be on the closer side from 2024, just because Ken Paxton is a weaker candidate than Ted Cruz, but still going to win the state, absolutely. Colin Allred's not going to win the Senate race in Texas, but it's going to be closer. It's not going to be safe, though, like it was before if John Cornyn had just ran up against a no-name Democrat. The expectations here are kind of brewing, which is what is informing my decision. So 49 for the GOP. Democrats have their fair share of likely states too. I actually forgot one of their safe states, Colorado. I should have thought of that beforehand. But Democrats have likely states in New Mexico, Minnesota, Virginia. New Jersey I'm actually demoting from being a safe Democratic state. I know it feels a little bit weird, but we have to acknowledge how close it was in the last election. I think the November elections will inform a bit more about what I can expect from New Jersey. But for now, I'd say, being at 44 and being that likely Democratic seat for Senate Democrats isn't the worst place to be, especially given since it was a point off from being a lean state in the last presidential. So we have to keep that in mind that, Democrats might get back to a point of winning it by 11, 12, 13 points, but I don't know if 15 is right up on my radar, at least not yet. Democrats at 44, Republicans at 49. I'd even argue, too, that given the candidates we've seen, Chris Pappas today announced his bid in the U.S. Senate race in New Hampshire, that race is going to be likely for the Democrats as well. So that brings Democrats to 45 seats. It really brings us down to 6 true toss-ups, which is not great for Democrats, given that they're trying to go into territory like Iowa, like Ohio, states that the Republican Party, held in 2024, won in 2016, again in 2020, right? Won in 2024 by pretty substantive amounts. When you look at the margins there, Ohio was 11 points, Iowa was 13 points. So it's really hard to see, honestly speaking, how these races are more competitive, which is why I say this. I don't think the Democrats are going to get back that Senate race in Ohio. I think Republicans are going to have the majority practically no matter what. Even if Sherrod Brown wants to run for it, I don't imagine it getting closer than 6-7 points, or maybe a little bit closer given the midterms. I just don't think it's within that realm of possibility that I think the resources would be worth running Sherrod Brown again in the Senate race. If anything, he should go for governor. On the Iowa side, I think that it's very tricky, right? Democrats think because it's someone like Joni Ernst that they have an opportunity. After all, in 2020, if you look back at that Senate map, Teresa Greenfield, if you remember her, I covered her race, covered all the races, right? Looking back at the election results, you can see that she did better than Biden, pretty substantively too, right? Biden lost the state by 8.1, Joni Ernst only won by 6.5. It was about a 2-point difference, 1.5-point difference. That does make a difference, though, in some races. If you look back in 2018, you'll see that Iowa was decided by a margin at which we would have seen the 1.5% swing made it even closer. Technically speaking, if 1.5% of the electorate changed their minds, we would have seen Fred Hubbell win that governor's race. So it's interesting in its own right, absolutely. But looking forward in 22, became a safe Republican state. I don't think Democrats have much to hope for in Iowa. So now we're down to 4. Where do Democrats move forward? Well, after the results in last night's elections came out, I think that given what we can expect to see from the 26 national environment, and even today, I do think that with Pete Buttigieg out of the race, we actually are narrowing down the Democratic candidacies to a pretty good point, even without him, or, by disregarding him. Either way, right? I don't think we really thought about Pete Buttigieg much at all, besides considering is he electorally viable in the Democratic primary, not as much in the general election, but that was a big question, right? Is he going to win the general? He needed to get through the primary, but could he win the general? And he probably would have won the primary. That general election was going to be a bit more tricky, right? It's always more tricky. But right now, I think Michigan stands to be a state where Democrats are going to win by a likely margin. I do think that with the right Democrat, looks like they're on track to get at least a strong Democrat. With the national environment that we exhibited 2 days ago, the one that resulted in a 10-point victory in Wisconsin and, 16 to 22-point shifts in Florida, I do think we could be at a point where Michigan does surprise many people and ends up being a pretty good state for Democrats. I'm also not forgetting that in 2022, Michigan went to Gretchen Whitmer by 11 points, and that in 2018, when Donald Trump was president the last time, Michigan was decided by a likely margin. It's well within its, history to be a likely Democratic state again. I think my initial hesitation was that if Donald Trump was to maintain his approval, and this was obviously a snapshot in time in February when Trump was maintaining a high enough approval, in fact, a more positive one than negative one, the lean result made sense. Today, it makes more sense to be a likely state, and that leaves us with 3 remaining toss-ups. Now, I think Democrats should be a bit disappointed in some of the news they've been hearing out of the Senate race in Maine. I don't know how much, we've seen discussion around this, but Susan Collins, who won her last race in 2020 by roughly 8.6%, granted, right, I believe her name is Mia Savage, if I'm remembering correctly. Let's check the general election. Is it Lisa Savage? I don't know. I think I'm combining Max, Lynn, and Lisa Savage. If you ever want something funny to watch the independent candidate, Max Lynn, in the Senate primary, Senate general election debates with Sarah Gideon and Susan Collins. Regardless, though, right, what we saw here was that Sarah Gideon, got 42.39% of the vote because of ranked choice voting. But if we were to tabulate all the results, chances are it would have been around a 3 to 4 point race. I say that to point out that 2026 is not going to be as easy for Susan Collins as it was Susan Collins, not Suzanne Collins. It just finished Sunrise on the Reaping, if you're interested in the Hunger Games book. Sorry about the aside there, but I keep mixing up their names sometimes. I'm hoping that I didn't do that this time. But Susan Collins is not going to have an easy time in 26. She had an easier time in 2020 because, one, the polling really said that Maine was going to be pretty solid. There wasn't as much of an emphasis towards the end. Sarah Gideon had more money than she could have spent in a state with 4 electoral votes. And so it all became a combination of problems that led to Susan Collins far outperforming what the expectations were. But she was outperforming a national environment of Democrats plus 4.5. Now with Trump in office again, the approval rating for Trump in Maine is going to be severely underwater, potentially even more than it was in 18. And even if it isn't, the national environment of 18, I do not believe through and through that Susan Collins would have been as solid. Now, I do think the news is not the greatest for Democrats in the Senate race. Why? Because it looks like everybody else wants to run for governor. That Jared Golden wants to run for governor, that Troy Jackson is going to run for governor, that Janet Mills won't run for Senate. So it's going to be interesting, right? Janet Mills is also quite old, right? She's 77 years old, right? Shelley Pingree, 70 years old in the United States House. The Democratic bench in Maine isn't as strong as Democrats would have hoped for. So I think for now, to play it safe, I'm keeping Maine as a lean Republican state, but keep it on your radar because I do think it's going to be far closer than many people expect, and with the right Democrat is 1,000% winnable in a way that it might have not have been in years past. After all, 2 elections ago, Susan Collins was winning her races by 37. 6 years later, she's winning it by just 8.6. Now could be time for flipping it. The last two races are Georgia and North Carolina. Now, the thing about Georgia is I am waiting in anticipation for an announcement from any of these Republicans listed here, but more importantly, Brian Kemp, who I do think that if he decides to run, will be in a really good position. Now, the rest of these people here seem to be considering saying, if Kemp doesn't run, I'll run. If Kemp doesn't run, I'd consider it. John King, Tyler Harper, Rich McCormick, Mike Collins. Only name that should ring a bell really is Mike Collins. But either way, all these people probably wouldn't do quite well against Jon Ossoff. And that's why they know if Kemp wants it, he has it, because he'd probably win by a pretty substantive amount, right? Take a look at the recent polling done. They also have matchups of Jon Ossoff against other Republicans. But guess what? Ossoff loses to Brian Kemp, but wins against everybody else. Wins against everybody else. Really interesting, if you ask me. Brian Kemp, in a way, sort of as a service to his party to run in the Senate race, but it's not, too baked in that he's going to do it, just as heavily consideration. Georgia right now, though, I do think Jon Ossoff, with the expectation that Brian Kemp doesn't run, which I don't know necessarily if that's fair to treat as an expectation, but I do think it's right in saying that because Brian Kemp hasn't publicly expressed interest, because there isn't as much conversation around the governor's mansion around running for Senate, that the rest of these candidates probably actually would come up short to Jon Ossoff. And I think given the national environment, it is fair to assume that would be the case. Now, for North Carolina, I'm a bit more worried for Thom Tillis in this race. He could actually face a pretty substantial primary challenge, if you ask me. He's not the most popular candidate in the race. I think based on where we are right now and based on the most recent governor election result in North Carolina, that North Carolina stands to be the closest Senate race of 2026, not 2028. Ignore me when I make that type of mischaracterization. I think North Carolina, based on what we saw last night, is well within reach for the Democratic Party, but it needs the right candidate. I'm not convinced that Democrats have a weak bench. I think a lot of Republicans are saying there's a weak bench in North Carolina, but Roy Cooper has expressed interest and has given nearly all indication that he wants to run for Senate. And with Roy Cooper, I don't think it would be like a Cal Cunningham situation, and for obvious reason. I don't think it'd be like a situation with Sherry Beasley, as much as I do think Democrats should have invested more in that race that they thought would be 7 points, ended up being 3, right? Those things matter. I think Roy Cooper, after last night's results, is the narrow favorite in North Carolina. And I know that seems very optimistic for the Democrats, and arguably it is, but it only puts them 1 seat closer to the majority and still down 2 no matter what. And I think that Republicans are almost nearly guaranteed to maintain Senate majority after 2026. I wouldn't be hopeful if I was a Democrat. But I think for the first time in a very long time, North Carolina comes within reach because Republicans got lucky in 2018. They didn't face a Senate race in 2018 in North Carolina. But God knows Democrats probably would have won it, given the composition of the House popular vote and given the amount of money that would have been spent on the race and the attention in the race, and given that Democrats are winning in West Virginia, winning in Montana, winning in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Arizona, all states that had voted for Trump in the last election. In 2018, very locked in and solid for the Democratic Party. This time around, I think North Carolina joins the bunch and joins the Democrats with a very narrow victory for Roy Cooper, a very narrow victory for that Democrat, especially given that Thom Tillis stands to be one of the more unpopular senators from the state, senators across the nation. And I do think Democrats would be well positioned for 2026 in North Carolina and in a number of other states. So that's the final Senate map here, 52-48. Democrats flip North Carolina. Everything else stays the same. A lot of races to watch. Not much really to expect to change between now and November 2026. But as is the case with American politics, expect the unexpected. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.